When I started doing this job, I encountered, pretty much for the first time in my life, people whose lives were being ruined by their opinions. People whose lives and families were being ruined by their beliefs. This was before Brexit even happened, but you would speak to people whose mums or dads were absolutely convinced that the fact that a family of colour had moved in next door was the end of civilization as they knew it. You would speak to people, and when they rang me, to explain why they hated immigrants or why they hated the EU. And what I realised was that they had been gaslit over decades into not only believing things that were not true, but into using those things to vote against their own interests, to vote literally for things that would make their own lives worse. You see it a little bit this week with the call from the right-wing media and others to join Donald Trump's ludicrous war in Iran. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu's ludicrous war in Iran. And they can't really tell you why they're in favour of it, including a lot of the pundits. They give you a reason for why they're in favour of the war, and the very next day Donald Trump will say, no, that's not why we're going to war at all. So you see it happening all the time. And that's why I'm mildly... Oh, not even mild. That's why I'm professionally obsessed with it. I don't give it a great deal of thought when I'm not here or messing around on social media. But that's why. I remember someone telling me a story some time ago about Fox News in the United States of America. And if you ever wondered why we don't have a Fox News equivalent in this country, in terms of popularity, GBB's obviously nibbles at the same territory, nibbles at the same food, but doesn't enjoy anything like the dominance that Fox News enjoys. The reason why Fox News never really landed in this country is because we already had the Daily Mail. We already had a hideously right-wing organisation polluting public discourse, promoting evil people and persuading populations to vote to keep people like the owners of the Daily Mail in power and in wealth. It really is that simple. And I remember someone telling me years ago that Fox News, when Barack Obama was president, was it a caller to this programme or was it somebody I met outside of the studio? I can't actually remember. That their family, their parents had buried their jewellery in the back garden because they'd seen a guest on Fox News claiming that Barack Obama, I think personally, I don't think they were even going to send agents to do it. Barack Obama was going to steal their jewellery in order to fund welfare payments for immigrants or some absolutely bonkers story like that. And that's why I have an enduring fascination with far-right media and evil commentators and columnists, because they ruin life for everybody, even those of us who can see through their hideous lies. And of course a lot of them can't. I mean, where, for example, is the line? There's some figures today published with regard to immigration. More people have come into the country, the increase in non-EU migration actually overtakes the decrease in EU migration. The latest numbers show they're both just shy of 1 million, but the drop in EU migration is more or less entirely filled by the rise in non-EU migration, albeit that the rise in non-EU migration is actually a little bigger than the drop in EU migration, which means, of course, that an awful lot of people from Asian countries, from the subcontinent and from Africa are coming here to fill jobs that were previously done by Europeans, which means, of course, that the preponderance of people who are not white is rising in our workforce as a direct consequence of Brexit. Do you think... This is what I mean by sometimes not knowing whether they're evil or stupid or both. Do you think Nigel Farage knew that this was going to happen and lied about it because his political project will be greatly enhanced by an increase in brown and black faces on supermarket checkouts or, of course, in adverts, as his colleague has already complained about in very hysterical terms? Do you think he knew that there was going to be a massive uptick in immigration generally and ethnic minority immigration in particular? Or do you think he was too stupid to understand what he was encouraging your mum to vote for? Genuine question. We'll never know the answer. I mean, was he diabolically evil, hoping for a massive uptick in ethnic minority immigration because that powers his political fraud machine? Or he just didn't understand what Brexit would mean in the context of the workforce and was too stupid to grasp what it was that he was going to be directly responsible for? I don't know. We may never know. Speaking of things that we are deriving no pleasure whatsoever from being right about, the introduction I did this time last week about the media's inability to cope with Donald Trump, and this isn't even a criticism because we're all guilty of it, the fact that you cannot not treat the President of the United States of America as one of the most important people on the planet. You cannot not treat his every utterance as if it were global news, because it is. And we don't know how to deal with the fact that what is global news on a Sunday can be the polar opposite of what is global news on a Monday. So I will turn, with your permission, to the Daily Mail first this morning to highlight exactly what I mean. You probably will be aware that Donald Trump was slagging off our Prime Minister again all weekend in sort of unhinged and largely fact-free fashion, but that won't stop the warmongers and the genocide apologists. Don't forget, these two things now go hand in hand. On this side of the Atlantic, from putting their fingers in their ears and going la 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 la, while the rest of us point out how insane this entire exercise is. And the right-wing media reports that as if that is the end of civilization as we know it. Donald Trump has slagged off Keir Starmer. The special relationship is over. The wrongest man in the world, Daniel Hannan, said something like, this is the worst thing that's happened to our country since Suez, which even by the standards of Daniel Hannan is pant-wettingly stupid. And that is a man whose pants haven't been dry since 1976. I looked at that story and I thought, I wonder how long it will be before the reverse begins. I wonder how long it will be before relations between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer warm up again, because that is how it works. And I do not understand why the editor of the Daily Mail, Ted Verity, is too stupid to understand that 24, 48, 36, 72 hours after writing about the end of civilization as we know it and the death of the special relationship and the worst diplomatic crisis since Suez, what was Dick by name Little John saying last week? I've never been more ashamed to be British. I've never been more ashamed to be British. And then you just press fast forward for like a nanosecond and relations will be restored. You just know it's going to happen because it always happens with Donald Trump. What he does on a Monday, he undoes on a Tuesday. What he does on a Tuesday, he undoes on a Wednesday. And no, I won't do a Craig David joke at this point because I can't quite remember the lyrics well enough to get it absolutely right. So what does the Daily Mail do now? So guess who didn't speak to Donald Trump this weekend? Nigel Farage. Having boasted about flying to Mar-a-Lago to... he didn't speak to him. Trump wasn't even in the same building. Guess who did speak to Donald Trump this weekend? For good or for ill, Keir Starmer. How the hell does the Daily Mail deal with the fact that the relationship that has completely broken down, the most embarrassing diplomatic incident since Suez, the end of the special relationship and post-war settlement, the immolation of the Thatcher-Reagan Accords, how on earth do they deal with the fact that it didn't even last until tea time and they're back on the phone to each other within hours? How are we going to report this, they all say to each other in the editorial conference room, because, oh man alive, we look like idiots again. They never say to each other in the editorial conference room. So they go with Starmer's humbling phone call to Trump. Humbling for who? Humbling for the guy who was trying to give the impression that the relationship was over, or humbling for the guy who has managed to pursue an entirely straight course since this debacle began? The idea that Churchill and FDR never had arguments or disagreements with each other is typical of the kind of historical ignorance you would need to write the sort of bilge that the Mail is now writing about Iran and that Daniel Hannan has been writing since he was in short trousers. And of course all the rest of them as well, Dick by name Little John, and all of the sort of weird saber-rattling cowards who are absolutely terrified of refugees but currently in the middle of calling for Keir Starmer to contribute to causing what could be one of the biggest refugee crises we've ever seen. So where are we? Where are we? 10:13 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'll tell you where we are. Tony Blimmin Blair. Tony Blimmin Blair popped up this weekend. He has subsequently claimed that he was at a private event and wasn't expecting his comments to be made public, which is, I suppose, an illustration of what happens when Peter Mandelson is no longer around to advise you on communication matters. But Tony Blimmin Blair this weekend let it be known that he felt Donald Trump should have joined, I beg your pardon, that Keir Starmer should have joined Donald Trump's probably illegal war in Iran. Tony Blair. How old do you have to be to have a genuine sense of shock at the sheer bloody front of the man? How old do you have to be to feel in your bones a repulsion at the entitlement, the arrogance and the absence of self-awareness on the part of Tony Blair here I mean, is there an age? I guess if you've studied the Iraq War, then you could probably get a free pass if you're a little bit too young to actively remember it. But the Iraq War was an unparalleled disaster. Arguably, it was always destined to be so. We'll have another look at some of the Chilcot report later in the programme and remind ourselves of all the lessons that are now being completely ignored by the likes of Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage and all of the right-wing columnists. And broadcasters, of course, we shouldn't let them off the hook. Wrong about everything. Brexit, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, austerity, Donald Trump, but not pausing for a moment to wade in. Wrong about Iraq as well, although I'm on that list. Wading in to call for more war, down with Starmer, up with Trump, more war, calling for all of these things. And Tony Blair joined their ranks this weekend. Whether he intended these comments to be more widely known or not seems to me to be moot. Tony Blair calling for Keir Starmer to join a war that Keir Starmer was opposed to. He was opposed to Iraq in 2003. The line he's adopted with regard to Iran is entirely consistent with what he wrote about Iraq in 2003. So you just have to ignore that. If you're a professional commentator or a right-wing politician or a Donald Trump fluffer, you just have to ignore that fact. What do you mean Keir Starmer's been entirely consistent for the best part of a quarter of a century on exactly the circumstances in which a war like this would be lawful? Oh, we don't want to worry about things like laws. It's absolutely extraordinary that Chilcot's all there. The bit of the good operation, the evaluation section of the good operation, which is a kind of précis of much of Chilcot's findings, make it absolutely clear what should and should not happen in times like this and in circumstances like this. And guess who thinks that we should ignore it? Guess who thinks that we should completely ignore the findings of the £10 million, 7-year-long, millions upon millions of words, 12 volumes. Guess who thinks we should completely ignore the findings, the lessons of the Iraq War and the conclusions of the Chilcot inquiry? Go on, have a guess. Tony blimmin' Blair. Popping up the, what do we call him? The Burke of Baghdad? I don't know. But popping up to lecture Keir Starmer, an international lawyer of some repute, on why he should join a definitely unwise and most probably illegal war in the Middle East. Sorry, I've got that wrong. A definitely unwise and... got it wrong again, sorry. Another definitely unwise and most probably illegal war in the Middle East. I just found it breathtaking. I don't know what sort of mood you're in this morning. I suspect, like me, you are split between fascination with the unfolding of events, knowledge that we all have a responsibility to understand as much as we can, and fear of the fact that some of the worst humans in history are now in charge of another probably illegal war in the Middle East. And I don't put Tony Blair on that list. You can attack me for that if you want. I think his legacy without Iraq would be almost entirely positive. If you speak to people from Kosovo or Sierra Leone, you will not recognise the man that they describe. It was not a joke last week when I told you that there are children currently running around Kosovo whose first name is Tony Blair. Like all one word, Tony Blair. They're called Tony Blair. That's their name, Tony Blair, because he is considered to be a hero. Similarly in Sierra Leone, and it was that desire for a hat trick, that slightly avaricious desire, that atavistic desire for a hat trick that probably prompted him to close his eyes and follow George W. Bush blindly into Baghdad. But he has weighed in on this. He has weighed in on this to the point where, and I mean, this is actually hilarious, to the point where the Daily Mail has to undertake the sort of contortions that you'd think even they would be capable of clocking. So if you were to go back to the moment that Chilcot was published, which, I mean, you're looking at July 2016, we were probably a little bit distracted at the time. The Daily Mail goes with a headline, This is what I mean, and this is why everyone should be as interested in this as I am, because these people have poisoned the well of public discourse for generations. They took us out of the European Union. They put Liz Truss in Downing Street. They told us Boris Johnson, who they still pay hundreds of thousands of pounds a year for his bloviations, would be brilliant. They explained away austerity as the reason why we should punish Sure Start centres in South Shields for the failures of bankers in 2008, but what you must not do is blame the bankers. They did all of this stuff. They told you Donald Trump was going to be great for the United Kingdom, and they told you in 2016 that Tony Blair was, and I quote, a monster of delusion. A monster of delusion. For 2 hours, Blair dissembled and denied in the face of Chilcot's devastating verdict. Then, with sickening egomania, he declared, I can't say sorry for Iraq, I'd do it again. And fast forward 10 years, give or take, to March of 2026, and they have the barefaced audacity, these quislings, these traitors to the national interest, these absolute saboteurs of our national tapestry. They have the barefaced audacity, the utter absence of self-awareness to cite Tony Blair's support for the war in Iran as bad news for Keir Starmer. What a difference a decade makes. 10 years ago, for the mavens at the Daily Mail, Tony Blair was a monster of delusion who was refusing to learn the lessons of Chilcot. First lesson of Chilcot? Don't go into Iran. 10 years later, now Blair delivers a stinging blow to PM over war. So Tony Blair has gone from being a monster of delusion to being a paragon of principle whose support for the war in Iran is a great humiliation and embarrassment for Keir Starmer, who, by the way, spent the weekend on the phone to the bloke who they told you last week was never going to talk to him again. All of which makes it crystal clear that anybody still in support of this war is either an idiot or an idiot. And Tony Blair, unfortunately, is probably the only exception to that rule, because his reasons for supporting this war are going to be a little bit different from yours and mine, if indeed we were stupid enough to support it. And that's what I want to analyse today. So question number one, straight up, draw on whatever interest, history, experiences you please. What was your reaction to Tony Blair criticising Keir Starmer for not supporting Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump's almost certainly illegal war? By the way, there's a new Ayatollah in town. I don't know if you knew this. He's the same as the old one. I mean, literally, he's the son of the old one. And according to most experts, he's worse. He's more, quotes, hardline, end quotes, than the last bloke who was supposed to be the most hardline person on the planet. So it's all going brilliantly well. They've replaced the old Ayatollah with his own son, who is more hardline than the old fella. The regime is still in place. There's no sign of the rebellion on the streets, which is a pretty obvious consequence of almost all the guns belonging to the 20% of the population that are still supportive of the regime. And Donald Trump is claiming that he's already won, except when he's claiming that he hasn't already won, and therefore he needs to do X, Y, and Z to ensure that he does win. I said it again. I said it 20 minutes ago, and I'll say it again. Best thing that can happen now, Donald Trump just calls the whole thing off and pretends it never happened. Marches around either claiming victory or literally pretending that it never happened. I've been completely exonerated. I don't know what else it counts as a good case scenario. But I do know this. You have thoughts on Tony Blair's intervention, and I want to know what they are. Because I have a theory. I have a theory that if you were wavering on this, and you can be forgiven for wavering given the amount of effort and energy that's put into promoting the course that would be worse for Britain, if you were wavering on this, I have a theory that Tony Blair coming in and saying we should do it would actually be the thing that pushed you into the camp saying, no, we blimmin' shouldn't. I genuinely can't imagine anybody observing the events of last week, ending up come Friday night, Saturday night in a place of some confusion and uncertainty, waking up on Sunday morning to discover that Tony Blair has said Keir Starmer should have joined this illegal war, and going, oh, well, that changes everything. Come on, Starmer, pull your socks up and get us into Iran as soon as possible. I genuinely don't believe, up to and including his own family, that anybody would respond to Tony Blair's call for another illegal war in the Middle East by deciding that just the thing we need and the thing we should be doing is to join another illegal war in the Middle East. And we haven't even mentioned the Board of Peas, have we? It's very late. I'm getting told off. I should probably turn this into a phone-in, but I don't have to. I'm more than happy to carry on. If you'd like to interrupt me, the number you need is 0345 6060 973. You now have, dare I say, a slightly better understanding of everything that's going on than perhaps you had at 10 o'clock, but I want to know what your reaction is to Tony Blair sticking his oar in. 0345 6060 973. Your reaction. Has he made it better or worse? Has he changed your mind? Has he confirmed your ideas? Or has he introduced something to the mix that I've missed? Tony Blair calling on Keir Starmer to attack Iran. Your thoughts after this.